Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Louisiana. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. In the late summer of 1855, plantation owner Miss Eleanor Braddock arrived at the sprawling estate known locally as Blackwood Grove in southern Louisiana. The mid-afternoon sun hung low in the sky as her carriage clopped across the gravel drive, the humid air heavy with the scent of magnolia and fresh-turned earth. Blackwood Grove, once a simple sugarcane plantation, had been expanded in recent years into a more formal estate, with parlor rooms, a dining hall, and staff quarters cloaked behind the tall cypress trees. Miss Braddock was known among the parish for her wealth, her strict demeanor, and her willingness to invest in rarely seen luxuries for the region. On this day, she arrived accompanied by a small entourage, her overseer, Mr. Caleb Duncan, a clerk from New Orleans named Thomas Aldridge, and a minister's son, young Julian Cross, sent to observe the estate. As they alighted from the carriage, the overseer directed a pale-skinned boy, Samuel, toward the front steps. Samuel was orphaned and had been brought in from a distant branch of the estate's holdings, a boy whose skin was unusually light, almost albino in tone, a rarity among the enslaved population. The presence of such a figure drew whispers among the workers and neighbors alike. Miss Braddock studied the boy for a moment, her cold glance assessing him as though he were a fine art piece rather than a living child. "He will serve my household," she said quietly. And so began one of the most unsettling arrangements in the parish. The domestic slave trade, a system described in historical records as the forced relocation and sale of enslaved people within U.S. states, loomed large behind such transactions, though rarely did local communities witness such a peculiar, attention-drawing pairing. Wikipedia +1. Within weeks of Samuel's arrival at Blackwood Grove, strange murmurs began to circulate among the enslaved households. A nursemaid, Mary Louise, later gave testimony that she overheard the boy weeping at night and tracing patterns in the dust on the console table in the parlor. "I heard him whisper, 'They do not want me,'" she recorded. In her affidavit, she described Miss Braddock's hand resting on the boy's shoulder as he stood stiffly beside her for photographs, daguerreotype-style portraits arranged in the parlor. As the weeks passed, Samuel was assigned tasks both unusual and isolating. He delivered messages to the mistress's private office, carried sealed letters at odd hours, and was seldom permitted to mingle with the other children or younger servants. Miss Braddock's inner circle speculated quietly. The boy's very appearance challenged the norms of the estate, and some of the enslaved whispered that the white-skinned child was being prepared for a uniquely ominous role. By late autumn, a series of disappearances rattled the neighboring quarters. 2 young women who worked in the linen room vanished. No record existed of their departure, no ledger entry of master's permission, and the overseer claimed ignorance when asked. One of the missing, Celia Harris, left behind a woolen glove embroidered with the initials E.B., Miss Braddock's monogram, found by one of the other servants beneath the floorboards. As winter slopped into early 1856, the local constable Jonathan Phelps was called upon to investigate. His official journal records: "On January 3rd, I inspected the premises of Blackwood Grove by order of the Honorable Judge Fontaine. The mistress, Miss Eleanor Braddock, answered me curtly, denied any wrongdoing. The records of her household show no formal departure of the missing servants." In his journal, Phelps noted the estate's ledgers listed Samuel not as a common house servant, but under the ambiguous term domestic acquisition special. The vagueness suggested a transaction outside normal enslaved hiring practices, reminding scholars of the broader patterns described in the historical accounts of the domestic slave trade. Wikipedia +1 Phelps applied pressure to Duncan and Aldridge, probing for witness statements. Meanwhile, a local newspaper, the Parish Gazette, ran a small piece under the headline "Strange. Changes at Blackwood Grove on February 14, 1856. The article reported that a pale child formerly unsold had been purchased by Miss Braddock, causing mild scandal among the planter class society. The editor speculated quietly that the boy's appearance and silent demeanor contributed to the unease. By early March 1856, The atmosphere at Blackwood Grove had shifted from rumor to unease. The plantation's workers moved in silence, avoiding the main house after dusk. Parish records show that the estate chapel, rarely used before, was suddenly ordered open twice weekly for private reflection, according to a clerk's note. What those reflections entailed remains uncertain, though neighbors later claimed to hear low hymns at odd hours drifting across the cane fields, sung not by the congregation, but by a single trembling voice. Miss Eleanor Braddock's behavior, once haughty yet predictable, had grown erratic. Housekeeper testimonies describe her seated for hours in her study, staring at an unfinished daguerreotype on her desk, a portrait of herself and young Samuel. One witness, the maid Ruth Calder, recalled that the boy's eyes in the plate were whiter than the silver it was made on, and that Miss Braddock would whisper, "He'll learn his place through the light." County correspondence from that spring includes several invoices for photographic chemicals, copper plates and mercury, unusual expenses for a private home. A shipping manifest from New Orleans confirmed repeated orders under her name. Historians examining the case later cited these records as evidence of Miss Braddock's obsession with early photographic experiments, a fascination consistent with the era when daguerreotype studios flourished across Louisiana. As the Wikipedia account of the domestic slave trade in the United States notes, technological novelty often intersected uneasily with human exploitation in plantation society, where appearances mattered as much as ownership. In late March, Overseer Caleb Duncan resigned abruptly, leaving a short statement with the parish sheriff. "I can serve no household where mirrors are covered. Lamps burn at noon and a child is made to pose like marble." His words were dismissed at the time as bitterness. Yet a week later, one of the remaining stable hands found Duncan's pocket watch tangled in the reeds near the bayou behind the house. No search was ordered. The mistress claimed he had departed for Baton Rouge. Inside the main hall, Samuel's presence diminished. The boy no longer appeared at mealtimes or lessons. Only faint traces, crumbs near the library door, small footprints in the dust of the upper corridor, hinted that he still moved about the house. Nursemaid Mary Louise insisted she heard him hum softly behind the closed music room. When she mentioned it, Miss Braddock dismissed her. "The house remembers its songs better than its servants," she said. By mid-year, the local clergy intervened. Reverend Tobias Lorne of St. Joseph's Parish visited, noting a stifling heat and a sense of confinement beyond that caused by weather. His diary entry, dated June 9, 1856, described the pale child as visibly frail, his eyes following his mistress with fear rather than affection. Within a month, both Reverend Lorne and the clerk Thomas Aldridge had fallen ill with unexplained fever, forcing the estate into quarantine. County ledgers show Blackwood Grove shuttered for nearly half a year. When operations resumed, several servants were listed as relocated, none returned, and among the new entries in the household inventory appeared one curious notation: glass plate, fixed image defective, a haunting reminder that at Blackwood Grove, even a photograph could carry the weight of a human life. When autumn came to Louisiana in 1856, the parish surrounding Blackwood Grove had thinned with fever and rumor alike. Cane harvesters worked in half-crews. The old store in Vermilion Parish carried fewer supplies, and the mail coach avoided the estate road altogether. Newspapers in New Orleans had ceased printing any mention of Miss Braddock, though one editorial hinted that certain rural holdings in the southern counties are beset by misfortunes best left unnamed. Inside the estate, the surviving staff kept to their quarters. Ruth Calder's letters, later recovered from a family attic in 1892, described the echo of footsteps above, though no one walks there, and the music room door swelling shut as though breathing. She wrote that Samuel was seen only once that season, at dusk, carrying a lantern taller than his arm through the cane rows, while Miss Braddock stood motionless on the veranda. No one knew what he searched for. The constable's second report, filed November 1, 1856, documents his return visit. The mistress appears composed, claims the boy is under medical rest. When questioned about Duncan's watch, she offered none but evasions. The rooms smell of ether. He also noted something stranger: glass plates stacked upon the dining table, each etched faintly with images of faces that did not match the household staff. Several were marked Test I through Test 7. Phelps confiscated one, later describing the faint outline of a child whose eyes appear open, though the lids are closed. Among academics, particularly those studying the domestic slave trade in the United States during that decade, this detail drew renewed scrutiny. Scholars argued that Miss Braddock's obsession with image preservation symbolized a twisted reflection of the trade itself, turning human life into property, then into likeness, then into rumor. The plantation ledger's notations, special acquisition and later glass asset, seemingly confirmed that the boy's role had changed from servant to subject. By December, parish deputies found the plantation strangely silent. Winter storms had torn through the bayou, uprooting trees and flooding the outer fields. Within the house, the air reeked of oil and rusted metal. A laborer named Henry Torrance testified that when he opened the cellar doors, the wind blew out my lantern, and I saw her shape in the dark, sitting straight as a board with her hand on the table. He fled before lighting another flame. Afterward, the authorities sealed the cellar and posted a notice of repossession. Yet in March 1857, Miss Braddock was spotted once more at the Lafayette station, purchasing mercury and photographic glass under a false surname, Mrs. Ellery. A local apothecary recognized her but said nothing until years later, when parish scholars compiled what remained of her accounts. By the following summer, the estate had burned. No cause was certified, though some said the fire began in the basement, where the daguerreotype chemicals had been stored. Neighbors claimed the blaze flared blue before fading into smoke, and that as the roof collapsed, one last flash lit the upper windows, an image, perhaps impressed upon the silver plates within, sealing Blackwood Grove's tragedy in its own cruel mirror. In the wake of the fire of 1857, the ruins of Blackwood Grove drew visitors, curiosity seekers, rival planters, and the occasional investigator hoping to catalogue property losses for insurance. The constable's third and final report described a gutted shell of brick and warped iron, the chimneys leaning like exhausted sentinels. Among the debris, he noted the discovery of several half-melted copper plates, their surfaces warped, but faintly showing images of faces, hands, and in one case, a small figure seated beside a chair. The record does not identify whether it was Samuel. The parish court declared Miss Eleanor Braddock deceased in absentia, though no remains were officially recovered. Rumors persisted that she had boarded a steamer bound for Mobile under her alias Mrs. Ellery, accompanied by a child of week. Constitution. The steamer manifest lists only initials, EB and S, followed by the note cabin, purchased in full. From that point, the trail vanished into maritime gossip. Letters from Reverend Tobias Lorne, who recovered from his illness, offer an unsettling reflection. It is as though she sought to capture the soul in silver, and when the flame consumed her house, it carried the reflection rather than the flesh. His comments, dismissed by contemporaries as morbid fancy, later resurfaced in an 1889 pamphlet compiled by Dr. Horace Mills, a historian of early photographic methods in the South. Mills compared the Braddock affair with accounts of traveling daguerreotypists who experimented with long exposures and chemical treatments that often poisoned their operators. He cited the Wikipedia-documented domestic slave trade in the United States as the broader stage upon which such personal tragedies unfolded, an economy that blurred the lines between possession, art, and cruelty. Meanwhile, the land itself refused to quiet. By 1861, during the first tremors of the Civil War, a regiment bivouacked near the Blackwood Grove site. Soldiers recorded finding fragments of burned silver plate and a cellar filled with stagnant water. Private Jonas Rudd wrote to his wife, "There is a stillness here that chills the men. Even our horses refuse the shade of the ruins." Local legend began to weave around these fragments. Freedmen traveling north after emancipation spoke of a pale child, glimpsed by the roadside near Vermilion Parish, guiding lost travelers back toward the river before vanishing into fog. Farmers claimed photographs taken in nearby towns, sometimes developed with faint outlines of two figures, a woman and a boy, though no such plates have survived for verification. By 1875, a lumber company purchased the property and attempted to clear it. Workers uncovered remnants of the foundation, and beneath a slab of scorched stone, a small metal case engraved with EB inside were shards of glass and a folded scrap of parchment reading, Retained light cannot forgive its maker. The foreman turned the find over to the sheriff, who filed it with other curiosities in the parish archives. When scholars revisited those archives decades later, they found the box missing. Its catalogue line simply struck through in red ink. To this day, the gap remains unaccounted for. Another erased line in Louisiana's darker ledger of forgotten lives and vanished owners. By the early 1880s, the story of Blackwood Grove had drifted from parish gossip into regional folklore. The burned estate was now only a patch of uneven ground overtaken by vines, yet travellers still paused at the bend in the river road to point at it. In the Vermilion Gazette of April 1882, a correspondent described a patch of cane that refuses to grow straight and a well that fills with silver-coloured scum after each rain. The paper reprinted fragments from older depositions, but the language was speculative, almost wistful. To some readers, the tale of Miss Eleanor Braddock and her pale ward had become a cautionary legend about pride and ownership. To others, it remained a genuine mystery smudged by fire and lost record books. Dr. Horace Mills, already known for his treatise Reflections upon the Southern Plate, returned to the parish that summer. His diary survives in the university archives at Baton Rouge. On July 10th he noted, "The field where the mansion stood yields a chemical odor. When one scratches the soil with a boot heel, a shimmer appears, as though particles of nitrate or silver cling still to the earth." Mills requested permission to excavate a section of the old cellar. The sheriff allowed a single day's access. The excavation yielded warped nails, a child-sized shoe, and a fragment of photographic plate no larger than a palm. Mills wrote that when he cleaned it gently with alcohol, the faint silhouette of two figures emerged, one tall and one small, their features erased by corrosion, but their posture unmistakably formal. He identified the artifact as Plate 8 and sent it to New Orleans for preservation. The crate arrived empty. The museum blamed careless handling. The freight company blamed humidity. The entry vanished from inventory. During the same months, two farmers clearing drainage ditches nearby reported hearing a woman's voice calling a name that might have been Sam or Sal. The constable investigated, but found only frogs and the hiss of reeds. Still, the rumors spread fast enough that parish children began daring each other to approach the ruins at dusk. One boy claimed to see a white child in Sunday clothes walking inside a square of mist. Adults dismissed it, yet each retelling stitched new detail into the story until by winter it was accepted as part of local law. When Mills lectured at Tulane University in 1884, he referenced the domestic slave trade in the United States as the grim backdrop against which the Braddock affair unfolded, a society that recorded every transaction but forgot the faces involved. His remarks, paraphrased in the Times-Picayune, reignited interest in the case. Reporters traveled to Vermilion Parish, seeking descendants, ledgers, or surviving servants. None could trace a single name beyond those already buried in courthouse dust. In that silence, the legend hardened. Visitors to Louisiana still ask where the house once stood, and locals point vaguely south, saying the earth there remembers light that never fades. Whether that light belonged to Mercury, memory, or the last flash of a vanished photograph, no one can agree. But when the bayou fog rises, the road to Blackwood Grove still seems to gleam as if lit from beneath the soil itself. By 1890, the legend of Blackwood Grove had taken on a scholarly flavor. Universities in New Orleans and Mobile were beginning to treat folklore as regional anthropology, and the Braddock affair appeared in several small pamphlets alongside tales of haunted plantations and lost manuscripts. Among them one stood out, The Silver Boy of Vermilion Parish, printed anonymously, claiming to be based on surviving testimonies and one remaining plate. Historians could never confirm its author, though stylistic clues suggest Dr. Horace Mills or one of his students. The pamphlet recounted the story much as county records did, but with unsettling embellishments. It described Samuel as a child preserved by light yet fading in shadow, and Miss Braddock as a woman who bartered mercy for reflection. The text even reproduced a crude woodcut, said to mirror the lost daguerreotype. A seated woman, one hand resting on a boy's shoulder, their faces smudged into featureless ovals. When first printed, the image caused an uproar among local planters who still remembered the family name. The sheriff ordered the remaining copies withdrawn, citing blasphemy laws that by then few understood. During that same decade, parish surveyors attempted to map the overgrown property for timber sale. Their notes mention finding shallow depressions where the foundation had stood, and metal glints among roots resembling tarnished coins. No coins were recovered, but a fragment of stamped brass bearing the letters L, possibly from Miss Braddock's alias, was filed among routine artifacts. The item disappeared soon afterward. A visiting researcher from Charleston, Dr. Elias Brandt, added his own chapter to the mystery. In an 1892 lecture, he referenced the domestic slave trade in the United States as an economic system that blurred sentiment and ownership until both rotted together. He cited the Braddock case as a metaphor, a transaction of flesh turned into an obsession with the image of flesh. Brandt concluded, what the South could not forget, it sought to capture. What it captured, it could not forgive. His talk drew polite applause but no challenge, proof, perhaps, that the subject had slipped beyond scandal into legend. That same year, local farmers complained that their photographic negatives developed with foggy silhouettes whenever they passed near the ruins. A traveling photographer from Baton Rouge tested the superstition by setting up his tripod on the exact site. His plate, exposed for 5 minutes, produced an image later described as a blur shaped like two seated figures and a bright patch where no light source existed. The negative was displayed briefly in a storefront window before being stolen overnight. The thief was never found. By the turn of the century, all official traces of Miss Braddock and Samuel were gone. Birth ledgers lost in courthouse floods, cemetery stones overturned by storms. Only the story endured, retold by cane cutters and school teachers alike. They said that if one struck a match near the old grove after midnight, it flared blue instead of orange, and that the air smelled faintly of mercury. The rational-minded blamed swamp gas. Others whispered, it was the same chemical light that once tried to hold a soul. By 1901, the parish road that once led to Blackwood Grove had been rerouted, cutting a wide curve through the swamp to reach the new mill town. Travelers who took the old track said it still narrowed between the trees until the light seemed to dim, even at noon. A surveyor named John Creighton, hired to chart remaining tracts for tax rolls, wrote in his field journal that the ground near the ruined foundation gave off a faint metallic odor. It is as though the soil exhales history, he noted, and no breeze will take it away. Creighton's maps confirmed that the property line still bore the original Braddock description, though the name itself had been scratched out of courthouse books decades earlier. Locals said no one would buy the land, not for cane, not even for timber, because of the light that misleads. They meant the pale gleam sometimes seen above the weeds after heavy rain. Skeptics attributed it to marsh gas or minerals leaching from burnt copper. Others swore it followed travelers like a lantern swung low. That same summer, a team from a new photography club in Baton Rouge arrived to document what remained of old estates. Among them was a young instructor, Lydia Harron, one of the few women practicing daguerreotype revival as art. Her surviving letters describe the day she visited the Braddock site. She set up her brass-bound camera before dawn, facing the moss-draped ruins, and prepared a plate coated with collodion. The mist was thick as milk, she wrote, and the silence deep enough that the drip of mercury felt like rain. When she developed the image hours later at her lodging, the frame showed faintly a seated figure and a smaller outline beside it, both rendered in ghostly grey. She dismissed it as chemical coincidence, yet refused to print the exposure again. A month later, Harron's assistant, Henry Boileau, attempted a second exposure at the same site. His diary, preserved at the Louisiana State Museum, records, "I felt watched though there was no one about. The glass fogged in patches shaped like hands. I left before the light failed." Within the year, Harron abandoned photography altogether, turning instead to landscape sketches. She told colleagues that the plate remembers what the living forget. Around this time, journalists revisiting the Braddock legend began framing it as a moral allegory, proof that even forgotten wrongs leave traces in earth and air. One article cited the domestic slave trade in the United States as the great unseen backdrop of every such tale, where human lives were catalogued like property until myth became their only freedom. The writer argued that the Braddock mystery persisted precisely because it was ordinary, a single household reflecting the cruelty of an entire age. By the decade's end, Blackwood Grove was officially removed from parish maps. Yet in wet seasons, fishermen still claimed to glimpse an old woman's silhouette on the riverbank at dusk, standing beside a round-faced boy who vanished whenever the fog rolled in from the bayou. The men joked about Miss Eleanor's reflection come walking, but none lingered long enough to laugh twice. By 1905, Louisiana's academic circles had begun collecting oral traditions before they disappeared under modernization. The Folklore Preservation Committee, newly formed in New Orleans, dispatched young clerks to interview parish elders about legends rooted in slavery, faith, and strange happenings. Among the testimonies archived under Vermilion Parish ghost light accounts, one transcript stands out, the statement of Mrs. Clorinda Phelps, age 78, granddaughter of the constable who once investigated Blackwood Grove. Her recollection begins simply, "Grandfather said Miss Braddock was the proudest woman in the parish. He told me he never knew whether she was possessed by science or by sorrow." Clorinda described how, as a child, she was forbidden to wander near the old road. Yet curiosity lured her there one summer evening around 1859, before the fire. She remembered hearing a thin boy's voice humming the same note again and again, and seeing a flicker of lamplight behind a shutter. The adults later told her she'd imagined it, though she swore the voice belonged to someone lonely, not ghostly. Her tone, as transcribed by the clerk, shifted midway. If the dead can hum, then they do not rest. The committee included sketches of the property drawn from surviving memory, rough outlines of the veranda, the stair, and the parlor window. Next to these was a small annotation, possible location of the photograph room. Researchers speculated that this may have been the space where Miss Braddock conducted her experiments with Samuel, trying to trap his image onto metal plates. Meanwhile, a historian named Edward Flannery compiled an article titled "Mercury and Memory" in the Old South. He cited the domestic slave trade in the United States as the cultural machinery that normalized both bondage and documentation, ledgers, receipts, even photographs as tools of control. Flannery's analysis of the Braddock case cast it as a metaphor for that obsession, the desire to fix identity on paper, to turn people into records. His essay noted, "When fire consumed the house, it may have freed what the light had once bound." During fieldwork in 1906, another witness emerged, a trapper named Asa Duval who camped near the overgrown site. He claimed that on still nights, the water in his tin basin shimmered with shapes, like reflections moving without source. He dismissed superstition, though he confessed to hearing soft footsteps circling his tent before dawn. His written deposition concluded, it felt like the ground itself was remembering something it shouldn't. The clerks filed Duval's statement, but marked it unverified. Within months, the Folklore Committee's funding lapsed, and its archives were boxed in the basement of Tulane University, where mold would later consume much of the original parchment. Still, fragments of the Braddock transcripts survived, enough to reawaken public fascination. By 1910, the ruins were all but gone, reclaimed by swamp and vine. Yet fishermen still avoided that curve in the river, calling it the Bend of Silver Light. Those who did pass after sundown said the air grew heavy like breathing through wet cloth, and that for a heartbeat, they'd see the glimmer of a woman's hand resting on a boy's shoulder before both dissolved into mist. By 1912, the Braddock affair was no longer front-page rumor, but an academic curiosity tucked inside journals of Southern folklore. Yet fragments of it persisted, circulating through lecture halls and tavern stories alike. The Louisiana Historical Quarterly published a letter from a visiting antiquarian who claimed to have located the final surviving plate of the Blackwood experiments. The note gave no proof, only a description, a daguerreotype showing two figures in formal pose. Both pale, their features half burned away, edges ringed with a dark halo like a solar eclipse. The editor dismissed it as literary hoax, but the phrasing echoed details found in the constable's 1856 ledger, too precise to be invention. That winter, a photographer named Walter Hammond arrived from Chicago to test new dry plate emulsions in southern climates. Local guides warned him away from the flooded cane fields where the Braddock estate once stood. Hammond, skeptical, went anyway. His surviving correspondence, 3 letters sent to his business partner, record his impressions with disturbing clarity. In the first he wrote, "The air here seems charged with dust that shines." In the second, "The camera registers more than the eye." The third letter, dated January 6, 1913, ends abruptly mid-sentence. Hammond vanished shortly after. His rented cart and tripod were found 2 miles south of the parish road, the plate still packed and unexposed. Weeks later, a fisherman named Raymond Duclos found a single photographic plate floating near a logjam on the Vermilion River. The image, when examined by authorities, appeared blank until tilted under lamplight. Then faint silhouettes emerged, one tall, one small, both staring outward. The sheriff sealed it in a paper envelope marked, "To be retained." It was never catalogued again. Around this same time, scholars revisited the broader conditions of the mid-century South. An essay by Professor L. Harvey Gaines, referencing the domestic slave trade in the United States, argued that stories like the Braddock legend survived because they embodied collective guilt, what he called the spectral residue of commerce. Gaines noted that the repeated appearance of photography in these tales mirrored the obsession with proof and possession. "Light becomes ledger," he wrote, "and the past keeps its own accounts." Old parish residents continued to supply smaller testimonies. A ferry captain swore that on foggy mornings he saw a flash like polished metal under the river's skin. An aging schoolteacher remembered her grandmother refusing to keep mirrors uncovered at night, saying, "They remember faces that forgot us." Each account seemed minor, yet together they traced the same outline, a reflection that refused burial. By the close of 1915, the site was officially listed as abandoned swamp. Yet surveyor reports noted strange magnet readings and patches where the compass spun briefly before settling. No development followed. Locals called it the Silver Field, where no one built and no one stayed after dusk. Those who lingered claimed to smell old chemicals, faint and sharp, like mercury rising from the mud whenever lightning struck nearby. They said the stormlight showed 2 forms standing side by side, watching the flash fade into night. By 1916, the Blackwood Grove legend had entered its quietest phase, half folklore, half warning whispered by the older parish residents, who still remembered where the road once cut through the swamp. The war in Europe had drawn attention far from Louisiana's backwaters, but for a handful of scholars and collectors, the mystery of Miss Eleanor Braddock remained an irresistible footnote to a fading century. One of them, a retired archivist named Clara Minton, traveled from Savannah to Vermilion Parish seeking what she called the lingering silver. Her notes, preserved in the Minton papers, reveal a meticulous mind determined to prove that Blackwood Grove's tale belonged not to ghosts, but to lost chemistry. She gathered soil samples from the old property, tiny flecks of what she described as grey metallic dust that stains the fingers. She also copied testimonies from surviving elders, noting that their memories often began with weather, the heavy air, the quiet rain, the smell of copper before thunder. Minton compared the soil to archival accounts of early photographic methods, finding that its composition did include traces of silver nitrate. She concluded that the Braddock estate's experiments must have left the ground chemically marked, an invisible relic of 19th century obsession. Her report was practical, even sympathetic. "Miss Braddock," she wrote, "may have sought preservation, not punishment, a woman grasping at permanence in a world built on erasure." Her article, published in a minor academic journal, referenced the domestic slave trade in the United States as the historical matrix from which such desperation emerged. She paraphrased its records. "An entire economy built on ownership breeds the terror of being forgotten." Her insight reframed the Braddock story not as witchcraft or haunting, but as a tragic mirror of the culture that produced it. Yet the parish locals mistrusted her conclusions. They said the night she finished collecting her samples, she camped too near the river. A fisherman claimed to see her lantern flicker blue then vanish. Minton reappeared unharmed the next morning, but refused to discuss what she had witnessed. Her remaining notes grew sparse, her handwriting shaky. The final entry reads only, "They are not light, they are memory." In the years that followed, Minton's findings drifted through academic circles, cited occasionally in works on early photography or plantation folklore. The original samples disappeared during a warehouse move in 1917, their labels washed away by rainwater. Without proof, her conclusions softened into myth once more. Today, parish elders still recall her visit as the last time the ground was disturbed. They say the soil closed over itself afterward, sealing whatever remained. Fishermen passing that stretch of river claim their oars sometimes strike something hard beneath the water, like metal plate. When lightning flashes, they insist the ripples show faint reflections, not of the present bayou but of a parlor long vanished, where a woman sits straight-backed beside a boy whose pale hands rest quietly in his lap, waiting for the light to fade again. By the early spring of 1917, Vermilion Parish was changing fast. Roads widened. The first automobiles coughing dust along routes once meant for horses. Telegraph wires cutting across the marsh like taut black veins. Yet the bend where Blackwood Grove had stood remained untouched, as though progress itself refused to trespass. County engineer Louis Herschel recorded the site during a survey for a new bridge. His logbook entry was terse, soil unstable, refuses compaction, metal glint present beneath 4 inches. He drew a small cross on his map and penciled beside it, unfit local objections. A month later, Herschel returned with 2 assistants to sink pilings. The men dug until the spade struck something smooth. Expecting stone, they uncovered a corroded copper box about the size of a ledger. Inside lay damp paper fragments and 1 small glass plate wrapped in cloth. The plate's surface bore a dim imprint, 2 seated shapes faint but undeniable. Herschel, puzzled, stored it in his survey trunk, meaning to send it to Baton Rouge for analysis. He never did. When the team broke camp the following evening, the box had vanished from his tent. He told the parish clerk that the night hummed like wire, a phrase no one understood. In June, newspapers turned their attention to the war overseas, and the odd discovery went unmentioned, except in a letter Herschel sent privately to a colleague. He wrote that the image seems to alter under light, as if the figures breathe. The letter resurfaced decades later among his estate papers, but without the plate itself. Meanwhile, a local teacher named Margaret Fontenot began collecting ghost tales for her students. Her notebook included one simply titled The Silver Mistress. It described a woman in dark skirts wandering the cane brakes with a pale child whose shadow bends the wrong way. Fontenot's account blended fact and superstition, yet her description of the landscape matched the survey maps precisely. She ended with the warning, "Step quiet. The earth is developing still." Scholars reviewing these fragments often linked them back to the pattern traced in historical accounts of the domestic slave trade in the United States, a system that catalogued every body, every name, every transfer. Until even after emancipation, the habit of recording could not stop. In their view, Miss Braddock's endless photographing was the private echo of that public ledger. Each exposure another entry, each image another attempt to fix what time would erase. By autumn 1917, heavy rains flooded the parish. When waters receded, the bend of river where the old foundation lay had shifted course. Mud swallowed the remaining bricks and the last trace of the road. Surveyors noted the site as submerged, no longer navigable. Yet fishermen swore that under calm sunlight they could still see, through the green water, the shape of a parlor wall and something bright resting against it, like a mirror catching light that no longer fell from the sky. By late 1917, the shifting of the Vermilion River had erased the last visible trace of the Braddock estate, yet the name lingered in official correspondence. The parish assessor filed a brief memorandum requesting to strike Blackwood Grove from tax records. The clerk replied in neat handwriting, "Property cannot be found for valuation. Recommend classification as lost to river." With that, the Braddock estate ceased to exist on paper. Still, the file remained open in the ledger drawer, unclosed, a blank space among other names neatly balanced with figures. That same year, as American troops boarded ships for France, a photographer for a local newspaper, Henry Lauvet, traveled the southern parishes documenting landscapes before they changed forever. His negatives, now stored at the Louisiana State Museum, include one plate labeled only Old River Turn. When viewed under magnification, The image reveals two small bright patches reflected in the water. Some modern analysts argue they are light leaks from damaged film. Others insist the reflections seem deliberate, centered like eyes. Lovett's diary adds another layer. On December 9th, he wrote, "The people here speak of a drowned house. They say if you photograph the river wrong, it photographs you back." His wording suggests he'd heard the local superstition firsthand. The next entry mentions a strange smell, like metal and rain together, followed by a line scrawled hastily, "I will not return at dusk." Nothing else appears after that date. Meanwhile, letters from parish families show how myth and memory intertwined with daily life. A widow named Eliza Fontenot wrote to her cousin that she'd seen a woman in mourning clothes standing in water up to her knees, holding a child. She added, "They were clear as life until I blinked." Neighbors told her she'd seen fog. Eliza refused to travel that road again. The following spring, when scholars catalogued post-war folklore, the Braddock legend was listed under Disappeared. Estates, a short commentary, noted that the tale echoes the psychology of the domestic slave trade, linking its obsession with visibility and ownership to the wider tragedy described in studies, such as the domestic slave trade in the United States. The compiler wrote, "This story endures because the South could not forget its own reflection." In May 1918, a final survey of the river bend recorded unusual readings on photographic plates used to map light exposure for topography. Each negative contained faint concentric rings, as if the camera had captured ripples of brightness, spreading outward from a single hidden source. The engineers discarded the plates as spoiled, but one kept a fragment as curiosity. Decades later, his granddaughter would describe how it glowed faintly when thunderstorms passed over the bayou. By the year's end, the parish officially rechanneled the river, burying whatever foundation remained beneath silt. Yet on calm evenings, locals claimed the water turned smooth as polished metal, mirroring a parlor no living person had ever entered. A still, silent room where a woman and a boy seemed forever seated, waiting for someone to reopen the shutter that the river itself had closed. By the first months of 1918, the Braddock name survived only through rumor. Parish clerks handling estate archives noticed that every record referencing the family had either burned, faded, or gone missing during routine transfers. One young typist, Miss Irene Cotter, wrote privately to her sister that, "Whenever I copy the Braddock line, the ink bleeds." Her letter, preserved in family papers, captures the strange mix of superstition and bureaucratic fatigue that hung over the story's final traces. That spring, an academic society in New Orleans, the Southern Historical Circle, held a symposium on unresolved narratives of the Reconstruction era. Among the topics listed in the program was the vanishing case of Eleanor Braddock. Professor L. Harvey Gaines presented, summarizing what little evidence remained: a burned estate, conflicting testimonies, missing photographs. He compared the phenomenon to the broader cultural habit of self-erasure in postbellum records. Gaines referenced the domestic slave trade in the United States as the foundation from which such silences arose, arguing that centuries of ledger-keeping made forgetting a mechanical act, one crossed line, one lost entry, and a life ceased to exist. Newspaper coverage of the symposium was brief, yet one journalist who attended wrote an odd footnote in his article. During projection of lantern slides, the final image, said to show the site as it appears today, failed to fade from the screen. The operator removed the slide, but its outline remained visible against the wall for nearly a minute. Readers treated it as a printing flourish, though the note survived longer than any discussion of the conference itself. In Vermilion Parish, spring floods continued to alter the landscape. Locals said the new channel carved by the river ran directly over the old Braddock parlor. Fishermen claimed their nets sometimes pulled up fragments of brick and tarnished metal. One described finding a strip of thin copper engraved with faint letters, EB, before it slipped from his fingers back into the current. A child on the opposite bank swore the water flashed like a looking glass swallowing the sun. The parish authorities scheduled a final inspection in April to confirm that no habitable ground remained. The inspector's report, 2 pages of formal prose, concluded with a single odd remark: audible vibration at dusk, resembling low humming or prayer. No follow-up entry appears after that. That summer, when influenza swept through Louisiana, the remaining elders who still told the Braddock story passed away within weeks of each other. Their descendants lost interest, and the tale fell silent again, folded into the general exhaustion of a nation at war and disease. Only the river kept its shape, winding through the cane fields like a ribbon of dull silver. And yet, travelers continued to note how the air along that bend shimmered differently. Never bright, never dim, but alive with a sheen that suggested something beneath, patiently waiting for another century to lift the curtain of silt and reveal what light and guilt had once conspired to hide. By the closing months of 1918, the war overseas had ended, and the newspapers filled with lists of soldiers returning home. Amid those columns of names, one curious notice appeared in a small Lafayette Gazette. Found, copper case of unknown age recovered from Vermilion River. The finder, a ferryman named Jules Renault, claimed he'd spotted it glinting in the shallows where the current bent sharply toward the bayou. The editor added a single sentence, contents indeterminate, to be examined by parish authorities. No follow-up article was ever printed. Renault's family later recalled that the box emitted a faint, oily shine even after being scrubbed clean. Inside, wrapped in rotted cloth, were fragments of glass and a folded scrap of parchment, too waterlogged to open. When left to dry, the paper hardened into a silvery crust. The ferryman's wife swore that under lamplight, two pale faces floated on it like fish beneath ice. The family sealed the find in a jar and stored it beneath their floorboards, where it remained until floodwater carried it off a few years later. At the same time, scholars in Baton Rouge revisited the Braddock materials as part of a post-war effort to organize Louisiana's folklore. A graduate student named Robert Lane summarized the case in his thesis, Mercury and Memory, an account of Southern chemical superstitions. Lane approached the legend as both metaphor and cautionary record. He wrote, "The tragedy of Miss Eleanor Braddock cannot be divorced from the systems that created her authority. In the structure of ownership, described within the domestic slave trade in the United States, the mirror was not luxury, it was proof." He argued that her experiments with light were extensions of that same impulse, to possess what could not be truly owned. Lane's paper drew modest praise from his mentors, but was never published. His notes end with a single observation written in pencil. Visited site at dusk. Saw brief flash from water. Not lightning. The rest of the page is blank. That winter, Vermilion Parish experienced one of its coldest seasons in decades. The river froze thinly at the edges for the first time in memory, and locals said that under the translucent ice, something shone like coins. A farmer broke through with a pole and struck what he thought was metal, but the sound, he claimed, rang soft as breath. He refused to return. When thaw came in early 1919, the bend looked ordinary again, its surface calm and brown, reeds whispering where a house once stood. Parish records from that spring show one final maintenance note. Bridge inspection. No cause for concern. Local light phenomena continue unverified. That was the last bureaucratic acknowledgement of Blackwood Grove. Afterward, the story belonged entirely to those who retold it. Fishermen, ferrymen, widows who still believed photographs could steal something deeper than a smile. They called it the reflection that never drowned, a name that survived even when memory of the woman and the boy blurred into the water that carried them both. By the summer of 1919, the river had settled into its new path, calm and deceptively ordinary. Yet letters from travelers passing through Vermilion Parish still mentioned the shimmer. A railway inspector named Thomas Hensley wrote to his wife from a nearby depot, "The locals talk about light on the water that doesn't move. It sits like a mirror even when the wind stirs." His words, meant as idle curiosity, found their way into a short feature in the Lafayette Courier, under the headline "Persistent Glow at Old River Bend." The article cited no legend, no ghosts, just chemical trickery from decaying minerals, but readers knew which place he meant. That same month, an elderly woman appeared at the parish courthouse claiming to be a relative of Miss Eleanor Braddock. Her name was Mrs. Louisa Trent of Mobile, Alabama, and she carried a faded portrait of a stern woman in dark dress. The clerk recorded her statement, I only wish to know if she was buried proper. When told no grave existed, Mrs. Trent reportedly murmured, then the picture kept her. She left the courthouse and was not seen again. Her portrait, placed briefly in the records, later vanished from its folder. Around this time, a mild resurgence of interest in early photography swept through the South. Collectors sought daguerreotypes and tintypes as relics of a vanishing century. Among them was a historian named Frederick Norcross, who visited Vermilion in late August. In his travel diary, he described hiring a guide to reach the old river site. "The ground trembles," he wrote. "Each footfall releases the odor of old chemicals, as though the earth itself had been fixed in mercury." He claimed to have found fragments of copper framing and one sliver of polished plate no larger than a coin. When cleaned, it revealed a faint line, possibly a shoulder, possibly nothing. Norcross sent it to a restorer in New Orleans, but the package arrived empty, its wax seal intact. His subsequent article never appeared in print, though his notes contained a curious draft of its conclusion. In this legend, we glimpse the shadow of commerce, the same impulse detailed in the domestic slave trade in the United States, where possession masqueraded as preservation. Miss Braddock did not invent cruelty. She refined it with science. Later that autumn, schoolchildren on their way to a harvest festival claimed to see a woman and child standing under the willows across the river. They were described as too still for living folk, and when the children pointed, the pair dissolved into sunlight. Parents dismissed it as excitement, yet one mother confessed that her daughter's dress came home dusted with a silvery residue that wouldn't wash away. When winter returned, the shimmer faded once more, leaving the river plain and brown. Parish elders said it always went quiet in cold weather, as if the light sleeps. And for a while even the stories slept with it, waiting for the next curious soul to pass by, lift a camera, and catch what the parish could neither bury nor name. By the turn of 1920, the parish had nearly forgotten the legend. Roads dried, harvests returned, and the younger generation treated tales of Miss Braddock as little more than bedtime warnings told by grandparents who feared the dark. Yet the river, indifferent and patient, continued its quiet revisions. When drought lowered the water that spring, children found odd fragments glinting among the reeds, thin curls of metal, darkened by age. They tossed them like stones into the current, watching them sink with a sound softer than splash, as though swallowed by breath rather than water. One of those children, Josephine Phelps, the great-granddaughter of the constable who'd once investigated Blackwood Grove, later described the scene in a 1950 interview. "We didn't know it meant anything. It was just a shiny thing that didn't belong." Her recollection, though told decades later, carried the same echo that scholars found in every record tied to the Braddock affair: a fascination with reflection, an unease around silence. Meanwhile, a traveling antiquarian named Simon Kell appeared in Lafayette, claiming to possess a genuine daguerreotype from the lost plantation. He displayed it briefly in a storefront window wrapped in velvet. Witnesses recalled seeing two blurred figures, perhaps water damage, perhaps something else. Before local authorities could authenticate the piece, Kell vanished, leaving his lodging unpaid. The landlord found the velvet case empty, the glass pane cracked in a spider's web pattern. Rumor held that the image had bled itself away. A few months later, the New Orleans Picayune published a reflective column titled "Light and Ledger: The Ghosts of Ownership." The writer, thought to be Professor Gaines under a pseudonym, tied the story once more to the broader framework of the domestic slave trade in the United States, observing that the past recorded too thoroughly sometimes refuses to fade. He argued that the Braddock mystery survived precisely because it illustrated the perverse marriage between memory and possession, how both could tarnish but never disappear. That summer, a mild earthquake shook southern Louisiana, causing cracks to open near the old bend of the Vermilion. Fishermen reported muddy water rising like smoke, and within it brief flashes of brightness. Some said they heard a faint clicking, like the sound of a camera shutter. The sheriff dismissed it as the settling of river clay, though he admitted privately that the noise continued after the tremor ceased. By autumn, the parish once again turned to ordinary life. Cotton shipments resumed, schoolhouses reopened. Only the oldest residents noticed how each new photograph taken near the river came out faintly veiled, as if the negatives had captured a thin mist invisible to the eye. Printers called it silver bloom, locals called it Eleanor's sigh. Either way, it settled into the emulsion like memory itself, fine, persistent and impossible to clean away, proof that the past, once burned into light, never entirely left the glass. By the spring of 1921, Vermilion Parish had begun to modernize. The electric line reached the mill town, and the first radio crackled faint music over the fields. Yet along the old river bend no one strung wire. The soil there refused poles, each one driven in tilted or came loose after rain. Workmen blamed poor ground. The foreman muttered that the place won't hold progress. Around that same time, a government engineer named Harold Quimby visited to photograph erosion patterns along the Vermilion. His camera used new glass negatives, heavy but sharp. When developed, the images showed curious defects: halos around water reflections, faint figures standing where no living person had been. Quimby filed a routine note to his superiors: exposure irregular, possible chemical interference from metals in soil. He later wrote privately to a colleague that the river light feels aware. His negatives were sent to Baton Rouge for testing. None arrived. Meanwhile, a traveling preacher held revival meetings in the parish. On the final night, thunder rolled low and steady, and he warned the crowd that not all light is holy. Several elders crossed themselves, for the memory of the Braddock tale still lingered beneath the hymns. They said the preacher's lantern flickered blue when he passed the river road, as if burning gas rather than oil. He left the next morning and never returned. In late June, a teacher from Lafayette, Miss Clara Duval, collected ghost stories from her students for a regional folklore contest. One boy, 12 years old, submitted a piece titled "The Mirror Under the River." It described a lady in black who keeps a child by her side and waits for lightning so they can see themselves again. The boy said his grandmother had seen them once, standing on water that didn't ripple. Duval, curious, rode to the site on a Sunday afternoon. Her diary entry from that day ends with, "The air shone silver for only a moment." She lived many years after, but refused to discuss the experience. Historians later framed these accounts as the final flickers of a vanishing folklore. The journal Southern Memory Review printed a short essay that same year. When ownership becomes obsession, its image outlives its subject. The Braddock reflection endures because the recorders of that age, clerks, constables, collectors, made forgetting impossible. The editor cited the domestic slave trade in the United States as the mechanism through which ghosts of the past were kept alive in ledgers and photographs alike. "Every list," he wrote, "is a seance disguised as order." By winter, a flood swept through the parish again, washing away the last visible trace of the old bend. When the water receded, the land looked ordinary, even dull, but the locals swore the new shoreline curved in the exact outline of a parlor chair. The sheriff, inspecting damage, paused by that shape and whispered to his deputy, "Best leave the past its seat." And so they did. By the end of 1921, the Blackwood Grove legend had become more memory than mystery. The parish rebuilt its levees, the river straightened its path, and the young no longer recognized the name Braddock except as something whispered by grandparents on restless nights. Yet even in silence, the story refused to vanish entirely. The land itself seemed to hold the residue of recollection, as though each storm unearthed a fragment of what it once saw. That winter, an archivist from New Orleans, Martha Lenoir, visited the courthouse to photograph surviving parish ledgers. She found the pages listing Miss Eleanor Braddock's estate warped and stained. The ink bled into grey halos. When she developed her film days later, one frame appeared inverted, the neat columns of numbers replaced by faint silhouettes. She blamed her camera, yet she printed the photograph anyway and filed it under artifacts, unverified light exposure. It remains in the archive, its pale shape still visible under certain lamps. Around the same time, a traveling journalist for the Southern Chronicle stopped in Vermilion to write about rural superstitions fading before the modern age. He recorded an interview with an elderly fisherman who remembered the woman with the light hands. The man said, "She ain't no spirit. She's the picture itself, looking for whoever's still watching." The line never made it to print, but the journalist underlined it in his notebook. By spring 1922, the parish launched a small exhibition of local history, maps, farming tools, and early photographs. One glass plate unlabeled drew quiet fascination. Two seated forms blurred, the background awash of darkness. Visitors argued whether it was a double exposure or smoke damage. The curator insisted it came from a family in Lafayette, no connection to any legend. Still, when lightning struck near the building one night, that single plate cracked clean through while all others remained untouched. In later commentary, scholars of Southern history often return to the Braddock case as a symbol rather than a haunting. They cited the domestic slave trade in the United States, not for its commerce, but for the way it trained a society to measure lives in ledgers and reflections. One essay concluded, "The plantation system created two inheritances, wealth and ghosts. The first dissolved in time, the second remained. A century has passed and nothing of Blackwood Grove stands above ground now. The river has long since buried the site beneath silt and reeds. Yet on certain nights locals say the surface of the Vermilion shines too evenly, no ripples, no breeze, like a mirror waiting for its next subject. Those who've seen it claim the light doesn't fall on the water but rises from it, as if the image beneath still seeks the gaze of anyone willing to look back." And so the story of the rejected boy and the mistress who bought him remains, unresolved, reflective, and quietly watching the dark turn to silver again.